All right, it's my turn. Welcome to Intro to Azure Blob Storage. There are tons of different options in Azure for storing data, and obviously data comes in a lot of different formats, has a lot of different characteristics. Blob storage is just one of the options you have available to you as you're looking to store some data on the cloud. I'm Thomas Rayner. I'm a Microsoft MVP and Cloud and Data Center Management. I'm also an Honorary Scripting Guy, an author with MVPDays Publishing, a Pluralsight author, and I do a whole bunch of other stuff. You can check me out on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn. I've got a blog as well, workingsysadmin.com, where I write a whole bunch of posts, mostly about PowerShell and different stuff. And you can get slides and demos and stuff that I use here on my GitHub repository in the bottom left. I've also got to thank Microsoft Virtual Academy. Some of the slides you're going to see are borrowed from one of their presentations. So this is not a comprehensive overview of Azure Blob Storage. It's kind of the tip of the iceberg. We've got 30 minutes, so let's see how far we get, kind of thing. You'll have to forgive me a little bit. I'm not near my usual recording and conference calling stuff, so there's at least one cat running around that's gone a little crazy, so hopefully we'll get through this together. Without further ado, let's get started. There we go. So when we're talking about blob storage, if you're not familiar, we're talking not about structured data or anything like that. We're just talking about more or less files and things of that nature. And so in most organizations, you have kind of increased capacity over time. Year over year, you might see your data increase 50, 60% each year. And so if you're going to keep all that data, you need tons and tons of room and room to grow and extra storage. You're buying new hardware every year. You're replacing old hardware with new stuff, etc. But the interesting thing is the amount of data that actually happens to be accessed. The I/O happens just to be the working set of the data. So you might have lots and lots of data in your environment, but the amount of data that you're actually working on at any given time doesn't tend to grow nearly as quickly. It may still go up, and as your business is growing and things are changing and you're taking on new projects or whatever your organization does, you'll see that the amount of data that you have that's kind of not stale but kind of cold is growing a lot faster than the amount of data you're actually working with. And so you get this kind of a gap where the stuff that you're working on that you need immediate access to and you need low latency and all that good stuff makes sense to kind of keep it local, especially if your offices are local. If you're not a distributed organization, if you have like one head office and that's where 99% of your people work, it might make sense to have a decent amount of storage there for your on-premises stuff. But all that data that you're not accessing very often, all that stuff that could be on another tier of storage that's a little cooler and a little cheaper, that's the opportunity to start putting stuff in the cloud. And so, as the Forrester source quote in the bottom right says, your SAN storage, is going to be a lot more expensive than your cloud storage in most cases. Obviously, I'm not a SAN vendor, so I can't price this out for you, and I also don't represent Azure, so I can't give you prices on that either. But as a general rule of thumb, you're paying a whole lot more to keep stuff on premises than you are to keep it in the cloud, and that factors in bandwidth and all the other types of overhead that go along with having cloud storage. So just another informational slide here. The cloud storage is obviously scalable, durable, available anywhere, anytime, and you pay for what you use. So if you've got access to 100 terabytes of storage, but you're only using 3 gigs of it, you pay for the 3 gigs in most cases, depending on what you have configured. You've got RESTful web services that can get at your data. So the compute platform can get out all the Azure storage, and using these APIs, you can get at your storage from anywhere on the internet if you set it up that way. You can co-locate the storage account with the compute account. You can have 512-bit shared secret keys, so you can protect the access to your data. And I think the stat at the bottom is actually a little bit outdated, but hundreds of terabytes per account, more data than most consumers or organizations are going to need at a given time, with a throughput target of 60 megabytes per second per blob. So that's not bad. And I think the 60 megabytes per second part is a little bit outdated, like I said. But you're getting a pretty performant solution. There's different tiers that you can order within the Azure storage, which we'll take a look at in a few seconds here. Some of the other options we have, so we're talking about the blobs today, but there's also Azure Storage Tables for non-relational structured data. There's Azure Queues for persistent async messaging, NQ, DQ things. There's Azure SQL databases for, these are relational structured data sets that you're working with. Cosmos DB, there's also managed disks for virtual machines and things like that now. Like I kind of said, there's a lot to know when you're looking at storing data in the cloud and even just on Azure. But what we're kind of touching on today is dipping our toe in the water, looking at the blobs. Pretty accessible examples are going to be coming up here in our demo section. Mostly what you're going to be putting on the blobs is big files or VHDs, which are big files typically. And that's going to be more or less what we're working with today, or at least an example. So, like I mentioned, highly durable and scalable. There's, trust me, a lot more effort, time, and money put into making sure that the storage in Azure is available than you could ever hope to invest into your own data center. The amount of physical technology that exists to just store your data is unparalleled here, as is the amount of effort and time and money that they put into keeping it all up and running for you. You get multiple copies of your data stored by default. The financially backed SLAs are nice. And you can store, like we just mentioned, objects, tables, drives, etc. And I mentioned a little earlier, there's support for REST APIs as well. So multiple copies of your data means when you have a piece of data that you put up into your Azure storage, it's duplicated across no fewer than 3 drives. And in addition, it's not just in one data center. Geo Replication is a term that means that if you've got your data stored in the West data center, like US West, it'll also be duplicated to another region that's greater than 400 miles away. So if you have an unfortunate situation where there's a natural disaster that affects one of the data centers where you've got data stored, just because the data center is inoperable or is having a tough time getting you your data, failover is possible to other regions where your data is also stored far away and safe as well. And it's on, again, several drives within there. So just because one data center flooded, oh no, what are we going to do? Well, there's a whole other data center already out of the box without you even having to ask for it, ready to get you your data back. And this isn't you having to fail it over. This is Microsoft realizing, oh, we're having trouble with this data center. We better stop routing people here and get them their data from another source. Additionally, these drives that you store data on are distributed. They're not all on the same rack, because what if you have a power problem on one rack here? So if I've got a VM with a persistent drive, you can see it animates very nicely, and the 3 drives that it gets stored on here are spread across multiple different machines. It's spread out all over the data center that it's in, and this is, again, just one of several data centers. So that way, if, oh no, we lost a drive, what are we going to do? Well, it'll fail over within itself there. So just because we lost a drive in a box doesn't mean that we can't keep the party going here. And again, really hitting home here, the continuous storage geo replication. There's an opportunity here where even if a data center goes down, your VM won't even stop running. So let's take a look at a demonstration and see if we can make this a little bit more relatable here. Where am I? I've got my MVPDays demo storage account already configured. If you don't have a storage account set up, I'm just logged into the Azure portal here, and you just click on add, and then you get to create a storage account. You've probably seen this type of menu before, where you provide a name, resource manager, what kind of storage you want to provide, and there's little mouse over opportunities here to get bigger explanations. I'm not here to sell it to you necessarily so much as introduce it to you, so I'm not going to go over a whole bunch of what you can do here in these options, but performance, you can have either the spinning rust, as I've heard it called, where it's just magnetic drives and they have physical moving parts, or the premium offers you solid state. How do you want your replication to work? Is secure transfer required? So does it have to be over HTTPS? All of this stuff will have an impact on the billing and how much the storage costs, but it's all still pretty reasonable, especially considering what you get. What subscription do you want to put it in? Everything needs to go in a resource group. And then location, where do you want it to go? Then it's going to go off and provision your storage account. And since I don't want to make you wait for that, I've set up my MVPDays demo storage account already. Now when you're in here, the first thing you'll want to take note of is if you go into access keys, hopefully I remember to blur this out in post-production. You've got access to these 512-bit keys here that you can copy and then paste into whatever you need. Take care of these. You can regenerate them, but you only get 2 at a time here. So you want to take a little care with how these keys are. These are secrets that you should protect. So if I go into overview, I can open this in the I can open this in the Azure Storage Explorer, or I can even just click on blobs, and here I can be presented with the concept of containers. So within the storage account, I need a container to hold all of the different files and stuff that I've got. So you can just click on add container. It's pretty straightforward. Give it a name and what kind of public access is allowed. But I've already got one called MVPDays demo container. And when I click on that, I see all the different blobs I've got. These are all just files. These are, if I click on one, I can see some information, when it was last modified, the type of blob that it is, the MD5 of what I've got stored here, and I can download it or I can delete it. I can just download this file right from where it stands and click here, and this is what's in this text file. The time and date right now is, then it's time and a date. So these files are stored in Azure. They're stored in blob storage. That's awesome, but how'd they get there? Wouldn't it be nice if I could actually put some data here? Obviously there's lots of ways. These have APIs and PowerShell commandlets and a whole bunch of different ways of accessing this data. There's opportunities for all different types of Azure artifacts to connect here. But what I've got is just an Azure Automation runbook that I've created here, and I can show you kind of a crash course in what we can do here to store some data. So on line 2, I've configured the variable key, and all I'm doing, if you're not familiar with Azure Automation, is there's credentials objects. This is just my automation account, or sorry, this is my runbook. I want to show you in my automation account, I've got, scroll with me, credentials, and I've got this storage creds credential that I've got, and the username is not important, but the password that I configured is one of those storage keys that I showed you over here. When we go down into access keys, this is one of the keys stored in this password area. So if I hop back into, come back too far, into my runbooks, I can go retrieve that secret, that storage creds, and store the password into the variable key. And now what I need to do is set up what's called a context. Context is kind of an abstract concept if you're not really familiar with how Azure works. But a storage context takes 2 arguments. It takes the storage account name, which you saw earlier was just MVPDays demo, and then the storage account key. And it can use those 2 things to create this authenticated context where this is the storage account that I'm operating in, and here's the authentication that I provided to tell you that I'm able to work there. And so rather than having to provide the key and the name all the time, I can just provide the context and say, okay, I'm uploading or downloading files within this context, within this authentication, within this storage account name. And you'll see the context gets used a lot here in this example, and as we kind of move on. So what's my runbook actually doing? It's generating a super fancy, awesome report. It's saying the time and date right now is get date, so that'll return a string for the date and time that it currently is. And then I'm just doing a little bit of work here to create a temporary file to store the output in. In Azure Automation, these run on ephemeral hosts, so I can save something to the disk without worrying about it being there for the next runbook that runs. So I'm just making a new temporary file here, and instead of having the .tmp file name, basically just renaming it to .txt in lines 8 and 9 here. And then what I'm doing, I'm just writing out storing the report content and where I'm storing it. This is going to show me the temporary path that I'm using. And then I'm just taking the report content and I'm saving it in that file. So setting up a new temp file, renaming it, and writing some content to it. Now I need to actually put it into my Azure storage blob. And for that, I have the commandlet in PowerShell set Azure storage blob content. It asks me what the container will be, MVPDays demo container. You'll remember here, if I come back and look at my blobs section, that's my container. That's where all the blobs are going to live in. I can have multiple containers and kind of organize stuff logically. You can almost think of them like folders, although that's not exactly what they do. I'm going to provide the context, and so we'll know which storage account this container lives in, and that we are authenticated to use it, as well as the file that I'm going to upload. So in that case, the file is stored in this report file that I generated earlier. So I'm just going to go into the test pane here and run it. This is what I'll end up getting. I'll end up getting queued up for a couple of seconds, and then it'll start. It'll begin getting those keys and all that stuff, and then before you know it, I'm done. So storing report content in. So this is the temp file that it created. It made one in users client temp, and then tmp b2e1.txt. Let's remember that tmp b2e1. And then it gives me some output here as I upload the file. So when I use that set Azure Blob content commandlet, this is what it's giving me to let me know that it was successful. It's telling me the context that it ran in. Here's the name that I uploaded. Here's the type. It's a block blob, not a page or anything like that. And then a little bit of information about the time it was last modified. And if we go back to our blob service here, I can look and see my B2E1 is there now. And if you were taking notes, you didn't see it there before. And I can click it, and I can download it and view it. And it just says exactly what we expected it to. The date and time right now is the date and time of, this is the date and time on the Azure Automation host. This isn't my local date and time, so be aware of that. And then I can start working with this here. If I want, I can hop into a PowerShell console as well. Let's maximize this, shall we? And first thing I'm going to do is, I'm logged in to Azure. And, not plural. And I'll see that I've got a few different subscriptions here. My selected subscription is my Microsoft Azure sponsorship. So I can just go get Azure RM storage account. And it's going to show me a whole bunch of information on all the storage accounts I've got. I'm just going to make this a little easier to read here and select the properties that end in name so that I can look at the resource group name and the storage account name. and I can see I've only got 3 in the subscription, including my my demo here. So we'll keep looking. I'm going to get my keys for the get Azure RM account storage key commandlet. Did I type wrong? Oh, it's storage account. Oh, that's embarrassing. There we go. And one of the things I need to provide is a resource group name, MVPDays demo RG. The name of the storage account, MVPDays demo. And let's see how that does for me. And I'm just storing all the output in keys so nothing comes back. But if I go keys, there's my keys. Let's remember to blur that out as well. And I'll clear that. What I can do now is set up my context. This is just like what I was doing in the Azure Automation runbook. And make a variable called context and set that equal to new Azure storage context. There we go. Storage account name MVP Days demo. Storage account key. It's going to be keys. I'll just use the first one. And there's my context. I can see the blob endpoint, table endpoint, storage account, and just by using this context, it knows a whole bunch of the stuff that I want to pass to other commands. So one of the things, let's go get Azure storage blob and just the MVPDays demo container that I want to look in, and my context is context. And look at that, it's all my temp files. It's the stuff that I was creating using that Azure Automation runbook. And you can see here I've got my B2E1 that I just made, so I'll copy that. And if I want to get the content from there, I can go get Azure storage blob content, and the container is MVPDays demo container. Context is context. The blob is going to be set value that I copied, and I want to specify a destination as well, just so that we can make this a little more obvious. I'm going to put this as downloaded.txt. Hit enter on that, and so it'll show me again some output saying here's the container URI, here's, so you can see my storage account name is there, the container is right there, here's the name of the blob that we downloaded and the length, last modified, etc. And if I just take a directory listing of what's in here, I've got my downloaded.txt. So if I go and look at that, I get the date and time right now is December 7th, 2017. That's the same content that it always was. You'll remember maybe that date and time was the exact same as it was when we downloaded that file through the portal. Pretty good so far. Now as an example, I want to make a change to this file and then put it back, because that's what I'm being paid for here today. So I'll just go some extra data for MVPDays out file, and I'll append that. So now if I check that file out again, I've got just some extra data for MVPDays appended to the bottom, and I can use the same commandlet that we used in the Azure Automation runbook here. Set Azure Blob, Azure storage blob content. Here we go. And I want the file to be downloaded.txt. I want the blob to be the same blob that I had before. So I want to overwrite that file, is what I'm telling it here. I don't want to create a new blob with the same content in it. I want to overwrite this existing one. And then I need the MVPDays demo container, and my context will be context. And when I do this, I'm going to get prompted, and it'll say, are you sure you want to overwrite? There's already a file there. You want to be sure you want to do this. If I had done confirm false or force, I could have avoided this. So when you're running this unattended, you can take steps to make sure that this isn't prompting you. But I'm running this in interactive mode, so I'll just say yes. And I get my information here. This looks a lot like from when I downloaded it, that my file name is there. My last modified is changed. And if we go back into our container, take note here, 1154.46. And if I refresh, 12:02:38. So I have a pretty good chance here that this has been updated with a new content. Let's open it again, and I can see some extra data for MVPDays. So that is more or less my demo that I wanted to show you here. Let's go back to our slides. Again, this is just a quick introduction to Azure Blob Storage. This isn't everything you can do with it by any stretch of the imagination. There's tons of different ways of interacting with it, but this is some really flexible opportunities exist here for you. Whether you're working in Azure Functions, Azure Automation, your own application, something that you're deployed to mobile users and you want them to be able to access or store data in a way that's available to them globally from their mobile device. But you need something that's robust, dependable, available, and affordable. You can do a whole lot worse than look at Azure Blob Storage. So again, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. If you want to talk about this topic or anything automation or cloud related, hit me up on Twitter at Mr. Thomas Rayner. Find me on LinkedIn. Leave a comment on my blog, and otherwise, I'll be around for most of the rest of the day here to chat, answer questions, and I'm going to enjoy the rest of the sessions myself. So with that, I'll thank you very much for joining me and hand it over to whoever's next.